Great. Good morning and a good Erev Shabbos. We are on Memvav Mud Aleph 46a. It's a bit more than a quarter from the bottom of the page. The line starts with the words Malahalon, and right in the center of the page there's the words Tanoihi. Let me show you. Tanoihi. Okay. So where are we? Yeah. We raised the contradiction to Rav being from the early generations of the Gemara. We raised the contradiction from the Mishnaic text. Namely, Rav stated that there's a difference between there's a difference between Paraduma and Egla Rufa. Egla Rufa, all work disqualifies the Egla Rufa from being a legitimate Egla Rufa, but only if actual work was done with it. So you pulled the animal with the yoke on it, did some work. That's an Egla Rufa. Paraduma, all work invalidates the animal, but even if you just placed it upon it, even if you didn't pull. That's what Rav said. Rav did not explain how he came to that conclusion, but that's what he said. Now, the Mishnaic text said that we derive Paraduma from Egla Rufa, and there, what was the contradiction? That the Mishnah provides a Kal V'chomer, rejects the Kal V'chomer, and brings in a Gzeira Shava, right? Or implies a rejection of the Kal V'chomer that brings a Gzeira Shava. Yeah.
Right, because Egla Rufa has its own.
That's right. And therefore, we conclude based on that, considering the fact that this Mishnah explicitly states that it draws its law from Egla Rufa, the fact that work by Paraduma that disqualifies, Paraduma goes beyond yoke is drawn from Egla Rufa, and we can conclude, therefore, that it's not more strict than the Egla Rufa. And just as in the Egla Rufa, other work beyond yoke is only if you do some actual work, not just placed upon it. By Paraduma, the same thing would apply, because you cannot derive a law from Egla Rufa and go beyond it. With either. We had suggested that you would go beyond it. That was because we were taking Rav at face value. But the Gemara is saying that from the Mishnaic text, which doesn't state explicitly that Paraduma is invalidated just by putting something else on it. It just says, how do I know other works are forbidden? I'm taking it from Egla Rufa, implying there's no reason to be more stringent than Egla Rufa, because that's where you're taking the law from. And thus, it would seem from this Mishnaic text that in regard to Egla Rufa, in regard to Paraduma, in regard to Paraduma, work is only forbidden if you pull it. Egla, by yoke, the Torah says explicitly, you can't go beyond the place you took it from. That's right. When it comes to yoke, the Torah says explicitly, you placed upon it, okay, but when it comes to other works, you can't go beyond the place you came from, which is Egla Rufa. That's where we left off. So what we're doing now is,
Find out how it can be expansive on Paraduma.
So more importantly, actually, what the Gemara is going to do is to demonstrate that there are different opinions as to where you derive that Paraduma's work is forbidden beyond yoke. Is it derived from Egla Rufa, as that Mishnaic text implied? Or perhaps it's derived from the very text of Paraduma itself. And if it's derived from the very text of Paraduma itself, Rav can go with that and say, don't tie me down by Egla Rufa's definitions. I'm deriving it from the very text of Paraduma. And I'm going to find the Mishnaic H text which does just that. derives it from paraduma itself, not relying on either Gzera Shava nor Kal Vachomer from Igla Rufa. And that's where Rab's stance would be.
And that's why he includes placing on paraduma is enough.
That's why he concludes that that's correct. It's derived from it itself.
Okay.
This is what he says. Tanoihi. It's actually a Mishnaic dispute. So you, the questioner, raised the contradiction to Rav, who is a sage from the Gemara. From a Mishnaic text, my response to you is Tanoihi. Within the Mishnaic text, this is itself a dispute. Diika, there are those Mishnaic texts, Maisila, that derive this law, Me'egla, from the Egla Rufa, as we saw in the previous text, deriving either from a Kal Vachomer or a Gzera Shava, which the Kal Vachomer was rejected, but nonetheless, it's derived from Egla Rufa. And Ika, there are other Mishnaic texts, the Maisila, that derive the same law, that paraduma is forbidden or is disqualified by work beyond just the yoke, migufa the para, from the body of para itself, from the text of paraduma itself. Okay, so now let's read the text which does that. Let's introduce the text which derives the law, expanding the definition of work beyond yoke from the paraduma itself. Even though, interestingly enough, as we're going to see, this Mishnaic text actually doesn't conclude in terms of the law the same way Rav does. But it still derives it from paraduma, and therefore gives more legs to what Rav is saying. Let's see. The Tanya, for we learned in the Mishnaic age text. The verse reads, oil, a yoke. Ainly ella oil, right? The Torah says by paraduma, asher loy Allah Allah, oil upon which no yoke was placed. Right? So ainly ella oil, looking at that word, all I have is that putting a yoke on an animal disqualifies it. Shar avodos, but other works, minayin, from where do I derive that other work will disqualify this paraduma? Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, asher loy Allah aleha oil, upon which was not placed a yoke. This indicates mikomokoim, any kind of work. How's that? So the Gemara, as Rashi explains, it says, the Mishnah is saying, as Rashi, this Mishnah text is saying, as Rashi says, the Torah could have said, upon which no yoke was placed. That would mean that only a yoke is an issue. But here the Torah says, upon which was not placed a yoke. So let's imagine there's a semicolon there. Upon which was not placed, semicolon, a yoke. That phrasing, says the Mishnaic text, putting the definition of yoke at the end after a statement is to tell you that you read them as two different things. Upon which was not placed, one thing. That's anything. Oil, a yoke. Right? Which means really that the first statement already disqualifies upon which was not placed. That words, asher lo Allah aleha, that in and of itself already disqualifies any work done. But then the Torah adds the words yoke as if after a semicolon. Which next question is going to be what? Why say yoke at all? Right? That's going to be the next question, yeah? Following?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Thinking not being pulled though. It just maybe it broadens the definition.
Not being pulled is by a glarufa.
I know.
We're looking only at para now.
I know. I'm just thinking just maybe expansiveness to what can be placed, not just yoke.
You can't introduce a glarufa here. The whole point of this mission is that it's
No,
only deriving
no,
from
I'm talking
paraduma,
about yoke, but the first part
upon which is not placed.
could be anything.
That's the point.
Right.
So why mention the word yoke then?
True.
That's the next question.
That's the
In
question.
Cain, if so, if the
Does
opening words,
yoke implies work.
well, let's see. We don't have to guess. The Gemara's gonna do it for us. In Cain, if so, if the opening words upon which was not placed is beyond yoke already, Matamad lemar oil. Why telling us the word yoke at all? Because the first saf, before the semicolon, which says upon which was not placed, already forbids all work, including yoke. So I say yoke. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah text like this. Oil, a yoke placed upon an animal, is selected out of the original statement upon which was not placed to tell you that a yoke has a unique law beyond other works. Namely, oil poisel, a yoke, would invalidate or disqualify this animal, bein b'shas avoda, whether it's on the animal at the time that it would be working, bein shalei b'shas avoda, whether it's on the animal at a time when it's not working. So it's unique. But shar avodas, other works that would disqualify the paraduma, considering the first half of the statement, which is upon which was not placed, ain poisles, do not invalidate ella b'shas avoda, only at a time of work. And quote from the Mishnaic text. So the point here is that this Mishnaic text derives the law that paraduma is disqualified by work beyond yoke, not relying on egla rufa, and therefore not limited to egla rufa, which is only when you pull it or when you do work. Because it comes from the words of paradum itself. Because it says, Ashaloi ola ala, upon which was not placed, semicolon, oil. But yet, here's something that's not clear in Rav. Rav did not make a distinction between other works and yoke. He just said, even if you put a bag of potatoes on it, it's forbidden. It's disqualified. Whereas this text makes a distinction and says yoke, whether it's at the time of work or not during the time of work. Sack of potatoes, only at the time of work. What does that mean? What does that mean? So when Rav's statement, which says even if you just put a place the sack of potatoes on it, what does that mean? Yeah. So Rashi explains like this. We have to say, this is where I was stuck. And so Rashi clarifies. We have to, Rav, if we're going to make this Mishnah, and this is the whole point, we're making this Mishnah consistent with Rav. Let me ask you, do you see this Mishnah consistent with Rav?
No.
Why? Because Rav said, no.
I'm saying that the pulling of the yoke.
There's no pulling of yoke here.
Pulling as a work, the kinyan or something, no?
What kinyan? It belongs to him.
Saying, how do you know if it's just not placed on the paraduma, the yoke, or the other work is not just the placement is the issue there with paraduma. How do you bring in the actual work component from egla rufa?
There's no egla rufa here.
I'm saying
there's no egla rufa here. It's all from the word paraduma.
How do you bring it into paraduma if not for egla rufa?
Again, so then we didn't follow. Egla rufa is out the picture right now.
Okay, but
we're deriving paraduma itself. So if you're introducing egla rufa, we're missing something completely.
No,
we're not deriving from this. The point.
I understand, but I'm not saying it clearly.
Yeah.
I'm saying that how do you bring in the actual pulling of the animal?
Who said anything about pulling?
Well,
why you even bring that up?
That's the distinction of how you can expand the work of paraduma.
No. Why?
Because in the text, in the verse, it just says placement, right?
Correct. You said anything about pulling?
Well, you have to broaden the
definition to not just yoke, even a sack of potatoes. What does pulling have to do with anything?
I thought that was the terminology that expands the definition of. Okay.
So that's what I'm telling you. Don't introduce into egla rufa. Egla rufa said that you have to do work and you have to pull the yoke. But if we're leaving egla rufa out and we're deriving it from the words of paradum itself, it's nothing to do with pulling. There's no pulling involved here. So we're putting egla rufa completely aside.
Okay, but we still have to expand
that it's not just yoke.
The work beyond yoke.
Nothing to do with pulling. What did Rav say? Even if you place a sack of potatoes. Did he mention pulling? No,
No.
you put a sack of potatoes on its back and it's standing stationary. It's qualified. No pulling involved. No pulling. Zero pulling. Because in Paraduma it says, upon which was not placed a yoke.
Okay.
Nothing to do with pulling. Yeah, clear?
I guess I'm stuck on the idea that how does paraduma go beyond just placement and not?
It's not beyond placement. It is only even on placement. That's it.
That's all it is.
That's all. Even a sack of potatoes.
Okay. All right.
So it's not about pulling versus not pulling. It's about yoke versus sack of potatoes or
Right,
bag
but
of
we
chips.
bring other things in besides yoke.
The yoke. Nothing to do with pulling anything.
Okay.
So now let's look at the statements again. What did Rav say? Rav said, Egla Rufa, you have to pull. Paraduma, even if you placed on it. That's it. That's all Rav said. Now, we assumed he derived that from Egla Rufa,
Right.
which is why we were challenged. How could you go beyond the source? Answer, he's not coming from Egla Rufa. Paraduma itself tells you that it's beyond yoke. And therefore, not limited by pulling.
The first part of that phrase, right? Other work, semicolon, a yoke.
No. Doesn't do all the work. Ashaloi olala, upon which was not placed. Semicolon, a yoke. Word work doesn't appear.
Not placed.
Yeah, exactly. The word yoke
are the terms that are used
in the Torah by paraduma.
Other than yoke.
Exactly. Sack of potatoes.
All right.
Good. So now we have two statements, right? We have Rav, which says that any placement disqualifies paraduma. He doesn't say how he derives it. He just says that as a fact of halacha. We're trying to reverse engineer.
Right.
Okay. Now we have a Mishnaic text that says paraduma is forbidden, is disqualified by anything placed on it, as per the Torah's description, upon which was not placed. Now, the Torah added the word yoke. Why did it add the word yoke? It's not limited to yoke. It's anything. So why putting the word yoke? Answer, because yoke is disqualifies at the time of work. Other things yoke disqualifies even not at the time of work. Everything else disqualifies only at the time of work. Is that congruent with Rav's statement? The point here is that Rav is deriving from paraduma itself, not relying on Egla Rufa. And this is what the Mishnah text does. It doesn't introduce anything to do with Egla Rufa. It derives from the very text of paraduma to expand the disqualification beyond yoke. Correct? Right. But how does it do that? It still makes a distinction between yoke and other things.
Yeah, I don't think Rav does.
Rav never made a distinction. So how is it congruent? So before I read Rashi, my thoughts were, okay, the Rav is just citing this, or the Gemara is citing this to demonstrate that you don't have to rely on Egla Rufa. Mm-hmm. Right? But Rashi gives us a helpful reading and tells us, no, actually this Mishnah is congruent perfectly with Rav. How's that? The Bryce, listen to the words again of this text. It says, yoke is forbidden, it disqualifies, whether at the time of work or whether not at the time of work. It doesn't say you did work with it. It's still only placement. But that placement is whether you put it on because you need to work with it, even if you haven't started working yet, or whether you put it on not at a time of work. You're carrying the yoke from your barn to your field, and you want to rest for a second, so you put it on the top of the cow. So it's not the time of work, still disqualifies.
But by saying not at the time of work implies that there's work.
No, it does not imply that it did work.
No, not at that time, but it could.
But it didn't.
No, but to say that it is used for work.
At which point did it become invalid? Did I put it on for the sake of working and I reminded myself, oh my gosh, wrong thing to do, pull it off. Disqualified or not?
Qualified.
Because it's a yoke. Okay, now let's go to sack of potatoes.
No.
I want to it's too heavy for me to carry, and I want the cow to carry it next to my next door neighbor.
Yes.
So I put it onto the sack of potatoes. I put it onto the cow. I'm nervous. I realize, oh my gosh, it's a paraduma. I yanked it off. It didn't move.
No.
Disqualified or not?
No.
Answer yes. Yes. That's the whole point. We're defining the definition beyond yoke. That was the point. We're going beyond yoke, Noon. Wasn't that the whole point? To say that paraduma is disqualified even when it's beyond yoke? Is that not the point here? Upon which was not placed anything.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Atazai. Of course. There we go. But that's only because it was at the time of work. What if I was carrying my sack of potatoes to my house? I wasn't expecting the animal to do it. And I put it on just to adjust my shoulder for a second. So it's not the time of work.
No.
The animal didn't walk. Now I took it back. Is the animal disqualified?
Not in that case, no.
No.
Because it wasn't at the time of work.
Atazai. If it was a yoke, it would be disqualified, even though it wasn't at the time of the work.
What does it mean at the time of just being?
Oh, so the way Rashi explains it. So that's why I looked at Rashi. Rashi explains it. And when you put it onto the animal, you did it because you needed the animal to do that work for you. If you're doing it because you need the animal to do the work from you, even if you stop and you don't actually let the animal do the work, it's disqualified because I placed it on it at the time of a work with the intention of work. That's right. That's how Rashi explains the terminology, time of work. Right? But if I put it on the sack of potatoes, just not because I needed to carry or to do any work for me, but just as a happenstance, because I was tired for a second. I want to adjust my shoulder.
You're using the animal.
So Rashi says it's not work. Because it's not because in other words, had there been a table, I would have put it on the table.
Right.
I didn't put it on for the sake of the animal's work with that potato, with that sack.
Right.
Had it been a table, I would have put it on the table. So it's not as if like I need the animal for this process, and if I put it on.
Or maybe sort of like an uncommon usage of the animal.
Bediuk. Exactly right.
Not something intended for it to do.
Correct. But when it comes to a yoke, even if it wasn't in such a circumstance, I did it just because I wanted to adjust my shoulder, still it would be forbidden. Now this is then congruent with Rav's statement. When Rav said, Paraduma is disqualified even if I just place the sack of potatoes on it, he is speaking of when you put it on because that's its job. Then you realize, oh my gosh, you took it off. Still disqualified because you put it on in a work context. But had it been a yoke, it would be even not in a work context. So Rav is almost like a half statement, not a full statement. And the Mishnaic text fills it up for us. Clear? Okay.
He doesn't give you both scenarios.
That's right. He's only telling you the distinction between Egla Rufa and Paraduma. Egla Rufa is only when you do work with it, and Paraduma is when you don't do work with it. How you derive that, he doesn't explain. The circumstances of that placement, he doesn't explain either. But now that we are citing to a Mishnaic text, which does not rely on Egla Rufa, and thus allows for a distinction between Egla Rufa and Paraduma, now we get a full picture of Rav's view. Whereas there are other Mishnaic texts that do rely on Egla Rufa. And if you do rely on Egla Rufa, then you cannot take the definition of work beyond yoke to be more than what Egla Rufa was, which means
you can.
If you are deriving from Egla Rufa, only if you're of the view that you're deriving from Egla Rufa, then you can't. And in which case, from that view, the law would be yoke, even if you placed on it. Other things, only if you did work with it.
Could.
We theorize that you could.
Because Gezer Shava, I would think that you could take the expansiveness of
and stick it into the text of the Paraduma.
Also preserve the stringencies of Paraduma because it has its own.
That's right. That was our Salka Daitach before we were introduced to a Mishnaic text. That was the Gemara's thinking before we introduced the Mishnaic text, which negates that thinking. So we, in the Gemara age, have to say, okay, nice thinking, but it's wrong clearly because there's a Mishnaic text from a couple hundred years before us.
Right, because it would be like
there's precedent against our view. There we go.
What's that called again? The
Meisvei.
Meisvei.
That's correct. That's the
Meisvei?
That's the Meisvei did to us. We thought one way, and then we saw Mishnaic text which said otherwise. So we said, okay, we have to figure out a new path.
Authority. So you. Right.
Very good. Beautiful. Bediuk. Okay. A little forward. All right. So that was the end of the Mishnaic text. Having raised that Mishnaic text, the Gemara now challenges it. So this already settles the problem with Rav. But now, while on this text, the Gemara does some further analysis. Namely, Ve'ema, we could challenge this thinking in the following manners. What's the thinking of the Mishnaic text? Asher loy Allah Allah, upon which was not placed. That's anything. Then it adds the word oil after the semicolon, And that word oil tells us that the yoke has a unique law, that if it was placed upon it, even not at a time of work, still forbidden. Okay. Says the Gemara Ve'ema, I could read it completely differently. Why don't I read it as a klal and prat? Asherloi Allah, the verse which says upon which was not placed. Klal, that's an expansive term. Oil, the word yoke, is prat, is a specified term. And what's the rule of klal and prat?
The limiting part has to limit the general part.
Klal prat, when you have a general statement followed by a prat by a specific statement, then the general statement has to be limited to that which it states in the specific one. And therefore, oil, only a yoke, is forbidden in, yes, that disqualifies. The other things, loy, don't. So you told us to read the Mishnah by you the Mishnah text told us to read the verse in two parts. Upon which was not placed, and then oil. If you want us to put that semicolon and separate between the two, then it's a kalam prat. It's a general statement followed by a specified statement. And when you have a general statement, anything placed upon it, followed by a specific statement, only a yoke placed upon it, you limit the general to the specific. And we're back to square one, in which only a yoke disqualifies.
Right.
So you undermine yourself by making that distinction.
Then that leaves us contradiction with Rab's statement again.
It's not a question of contradiction with Rab, it's a challenge to the Mishnah. In other words, we in the Gemara a couple hundred years later are looking at this Mishnah, we have to reverse engineer to figure out what it was thinking. Right. We cannot say, oh, it's wrong and discount it. So we already settled Rab that he follows that Mishnah. But now to that Mishnah itself, what are you thinking? Right? That's the Gemara is doing now. To which the Gemara responds and says, Asher, that ribuyahu is an inclusive term. Okay, so it's not, Rashi doesn't give any commentary here. It's not quite clear what the Gemara is trying to do, but this is my understanding. You have klal and prat, which is a general statement and then a specific statement, which over here would be upon which was not placed. Klal, general statement. Yoke, prat, specific statement. Then you have what's called ribuya. A ribuy means ribuy. It means multiple, like Rav means multiple. Ribuy means multiple. Yeah, ribuy. Here, ribuya. Right? It means multiple. Now, it's not the same thing as a klal. A klal is a statement that is not specified and therefore includes all possibilities. A ribuy means it's an added phrase to add something. Not a general statement that includes everything, but it's an added word that adds something specific. Okay. Now here I have a klal and prat, upon which was not placed. Klal, it's anything. Oil is prat, specific. But says the Gemara, before the word upon which was not placed, we have the word that. Asher. That upon which was not placed. And that word that is not a klal, it's not a general statement, but it's an added word that tells us add something here. And because it tells me add something here, it's telling me don't close off your general statement. That's what that ribuy does. Rashi doesn't explain it, but that's what it seems to me to be correct. The general statement I'm about to tell you, which is upon which was not placed, it's preceded by a ribuy, it's preceded by asher, by that extra terminology to tell you that don't close down this general statement upon which was not placed. Don't limit it.
Oh, don't limit it.
Exactly. Don't close it down. Don't limit it. It's not, even though there is a klal prat, it's the precipitation. If the fact that it's preceded by an extra word is to tell you, don't limit what I'm about to tell you because there's an added word here.
A ribuy.
A ribuy. Rashi doesn't explain this, but so it seems correct to me. If someone watching this has a different explanation, I'd be happy to hear it.
What does that mean? The word that.
Sorry? What does the word that mean?
Asher, it was asher.
Asher, yeah.
The ribuy.
That's the ribuy.
And that's translated as that.
That, or that which.
And that doesn't mean anything in and of itself. It just means to, hey, when you see the word that, it means don't make
only when it's unnecessary.
General.
Only when you could have skipped the word.
And here, I guess you can skip.
You could have skipped it, yeah.
There's nothing.
It could have said, "Lo Allah." Nothing was placed on it, without saying that which upon it was not placed. Just say upon it was not placed. Not saying that which.
I was thinking that.
Why the redundancy?
Sorry?
So why the redundancy then?
So that you and I can have all this fun. Why the redundancy? In what manner? Meaning it could have said what?
Specific,
Be more clear.
clear.
Yeah, look, that's all of Torah. All of Torah is unclear, and Hashem gave us rules that we can break our heads to figure it out. Right? Like Shabbos. Hashem says, don't do malacha. What's a malacha? No idea. Go figure it out. Oh, it's 39 because of the Beis Hamikdash and because of the Mishkan. I forgot. What's the definition of malacha?
That seems more like the word that in here. It seems a lot like bo, like that.
And not something else.
Right.
Right, but okay, that's a good point. That would be the case if the word asher was next to the word oil, which is a specific. But the word asher is actually next to the klal. So to use your logic, it would be that which nothing was placed upon it, that which, all of this.
But it's not.
It's the asher is actually placed next to the klal, which would give it more added emphasis, giving the klal a more added emphasis. If the word ba and it is to specify because it's in this and not somewhere else, then asher would be follow this klal and not this specific definition of later. To follow your logic, because the asher, and maybe that's taka pshat here, maybe that's indeed what the Gemara is saying. That the word asher put next to the klal is to tell you that which upon nothing was placed, because this is the thing you should be following, this klal. Maybe Gemara isn't clear. All the Gemara says, the only word the Gemara puts 3 words. Asher is a ribui. How you get from that to expanding the definition to everything, the Gemara doesn't specify, and neither does Rashi. So I'm just suggesting that the very fact that it's an extra word added prior to the klal is to tell you, put more emphasis on this klal and don't limit it as you normally would, and therefore use the prat of oil to teach you something else. Namely, to teach you that oil is a unique law that even at the time of work. This is the exercise. On Monday, B'ezrat Hashem, the Gemara is going to tell us that we actually find a very similar exercise done by Eglah Rufa. So we're going to have a repeat of this exercise, but the next time it's going to be in Eglah Rufa. A very similar sort of exercise. Yeah. Okay, wonderful day and a good Ner Shabbos.